Good morning, everyone. My name is Jędrzej Jander, and today it is my great pleasure to welcome Louis Wierenga as our guest. Our conversation will focus on his chapter from a recent policy paper published by the Institute of Central Europe in Lublin, which I represent. You will find a link to that publication in a video description below and on the Institute's website. To begin with, let me say a few words about our guest. Louis is a lecturer in international relations at the Baltic Defence College in Tartu in Estonia. He also works as an analyst and researcher at the Johan Skytte Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu. His PhD thesis, which is in the final stages of completion, focuses on social media narratives, identity, and foreign policy ideas of the far right in the Baltic states. Earlier, he completed his master's degree at the University of Toronto. But what I think really sets him apart from many of his fellow academicians is that he didn't come to this work straight from the classroom. Before joining academia, he served in the US Marine Corps. His research spans a variety of issues from far-right movements in Central and Eastern Europe to emerging and potentially disruptive technologies, as well as information warfare and politics in general in the Baltic region. Most recently, he wrote a chapter to a policy paper published by the Institute of Central Europe in Lublin, where he poses a slightly provocative question. Is the Baltic Sea really becoming a NATO lake? As you can probably guess, the answer is not as simple and straightforward as many would like to think. However, it gives us a great starting point today as we dig into NATO's strategic position with its strong and as well as weak points, especially when it comes to Russia and the protection of the alliance's eastern flank. Now, let us talk briefly about the content of your chapter in the policy paper. Louis, how did Sweden and Finland joining NATO change the balance of power in the Baltic? Does it really, as some people tend to view it, equip the alliance with instruments and means to achieve full operational dominance in the event of full-scale conflict with Russia?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a privilege to have contributed to this special issue, and it's definitely a privilege to be on this video series. And thank you very much for the very kind introduction. So when we talk about Sweden and Finland joining, the alliance, that was huge. That was really, really huge politically, strategically, operationally, and even tactically. Finland has always, well, both countries, I should say, have always been working alongside NATO very closely. Both countries are obviously also EU member states, but Finland had a slightly more, how should I say, geographically realistic point of view of Russia, and Sweden, of course, wanted to remain as they were until they realized that actually the security environment has changed. Russia has gone down a course of militarization and aggression that just is not going to be reversible at any point in time in the near to even medium term future. So the decision to actually, request to join the alliance, and then of course both countries now have, politically underscores the importance of NATO. Not that that would have needed anything else. I think that has been acutely obvious to everybody why Poland and why the Baltic states wanted to join a long time ago, and why Ukraine, wants to join now. And so that's the political aspects. Now, when we get to the military aspects, because that was largely what this was about, but my chapter actually does highlight the political component of this as well. Um, Sweden has submarines that give, the alliance undersea advantage in the, relatively shallow waters that are the Baltic Sea. And they can complicate Russia's operations, and they can also protect critical infrastructure. But it's not just the subs. I mean, they of course don't alone decide the balance. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight in my chapter, I mean, it says it right at the beginning. I was asked to assess whether or not we can actually consider the Baltic Sea a NATO lake. And so I said, well, politically, strategically, operationally. So I tried to put together the big picture, and of course, rather yes than no. I mean, I do believe that NATO has um, an advantage, and our advantage is that we are now several nations in the Baltic Sea region, 32 nations in the entirety of the alliance. So rather yes than no. Uh, Politically and geographically, absolutely. But from a strategic and operational perspective, and I try to highlight this in the article, um, it's not fully, but it's still rather yes than no. And what I mean by that is that Russia still has presence, and that we should never ever believe that an adversary is weaker than they actually are. We have to look at the facts, and we have to, you highlighted my service in the United States Marine Corps, and I appreciate that. We have a say. I was in the infantry, so that most gung-ho part of the United States Marine Corps, the whole branch of service is tailored around pray for peace, prepare for war. And I think that you have to always be ready for a black swan event, potential aggression. And so back to Sweden, um, they're strong precisely because they bring a system. They don't bring just platforms, and they also have deep regional expertise. So when Sweden and Finland joined, they reshaped the strategic perimeters in the region, and they did help to turn the Baltic Sea into a near enclosed maritime zone that's dominated by Allied forces. But it's not, there's still the Kaliningrad enclave there. And so that's something that Russia obviously was not happy about. I mean, they've been a little bit lukewarm and a little bit hot and cold about accepting those facts, because that happened obviously after they enacted the second phase of their war of aggression against Ukraine. But one of the things that, Sweden brings to the table is enhancing sea denial, ISR capabilities, seabed warfare, and they can kind of entice Russia to devote resources to a defensive posture. Um, but there's other things too. So critical infrastructure has been very, very hot recently because of everything going on with the Shadow Fleet, with sabotage against undersea critical infrastructure, which is part of the gray zone attacks. And many seabed incidents can really be executed with commercial vessels, which is what you're seeing flying under, dubious flags, with anchors, with UUVs even. So other aspects as well is surface and coastal defense integration, and that's really important when we think about the strategically located operating environment, which includes the island of Gothenburg. And then interoperability with NATO. I mean, NATO has a Baltic posture now, and I think that our claim as an alliance is that we have an advantage now, with now two countries in the actual region of the Baltic Sea on NATO's northeastern flank that weren't part of the alliance before. And politically, everything politically, operationally, and strategically, everything kind of aligns quite nicely because there's the reason that I highlighted why these countries joined and then what they bring to the table to further help to secure one of the most important and crucial geographical components of NATO. Now, I should mention a lot of people watching this probably already know NATO has a 360-degree approach. So that means that every part of the alliance, from Portugal to Canada, from Italy to Norway, from Latvia to the United Kingdom, it's all part of NATO's security. But I don't think that it's any secret that the eastern flank, but especially the northeastern flank, is one of the most contested areas. And up until a couple of years ago, there was largely only a land focus. And now we have what is known as multi-domain operations. So land, air, sea, cyber kind of cuts through all of those. And the air and the maritime components have become more and more important since 2022. And if you look at the amount of hybrid attacks that have happened, they've tripled and quadrupled since 2023, all the way up until now. I mean, it was one Christmas ago, on actual Christmas, as we're approaching Christmas of this year, that there was a major gray zone attack in the Baltic Sea region. So having further forces there that bolster operational capability is an incredible force multiplier that we are absolutely fortunate to have in the alliance right now.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And you highlighted that the Baltic is nearly, but not fully enclosed by NATO. I would like to ask you about Russia's specific capabilities that, in the event of a full-scale conflict, should be neutralized by the alliance to prevent, for example, Kaliningrad-based weaponry from cutting Poland and other allies from off Western supplies. Mm, what can you tell me about these capabilities? What are the most dangerous weapons that Russia possess in this respect?
Well, I think that a couple of things about that. I mean, Kaliningrad is the centerpiece of Russia's regional A2AD. So they can't entirely own the Baltic Sea region, but they can contest access and create a series of serious early phase dilemmas. So, one of the things that they could do is try to create a window where the situational awareness of the alliance is degraded, and they could use cyber, they could use electronic warfare, um, GPS interference, and where ships, ports, and airfields they face a credible missile threat. And this can complicate reinforcements because the Baltic states, as we call them, the three Bs, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as Finland, are sensitive to timelines. So delays could matter almost as much as losses. Now, when it comes to Poland, much larger country, obviously geographically, and Russia can't really seal Poland off in that sense. But they can try to disrupt by striking or threatening critical nodes, so critical infrastructure. So, for example, ports or rail junctions or fuel deposits or air defense sites. Um, and they'll do that especially if they believe that escalation control is favorable to them. And I think a lot of what we saw this past autumn with air incursions was boundary testing, first and foremost, and also looking at how different allied countries would respond to air incursions, as well as the alliance collectively. So even, very, very credible threats, they can have, operational threats because then you prepare for sort of an updated, contemporary security environment where you see that more and more things are happening, let's say with drones, or with UUVs, underwater. Um, And, Kaliningrad could raise the costs of reinforcement, but it can't reliably stop the alliance from sustaining Poland or the wider theater of the BASR, as we call it, the Baltic Sea region, if NATO is able to really suppress, the kill chain. So, the missile threat from Russia, the Iskander SS-26 system and its role and capabilities as a conventional strike threat. Those are relevant to logistical nodes and ports. The coastal missile systems, bastionics, they're widely assessed as sea denial tools that are able to threaten ships and complicate movement in the Baltic Sea. And so I think that you know, as NATO adjusts to this, they are starting to think more and more about multi-domain operations, as I mentioned in your last question. Um, and in peace and in the gray zone, um, the UN's law of the seas kind of it doesn't prevent robust maritime control measures in an actual armed conflict, but the legal understanding shifts from the law of the sea in peacetime to the law of armed conflict. But legally, and I'm not a legal expert, I'm very much a political scientist, but Russia operates in the gray zone right now, and they operate with plausible deniability. And I'll leave it to legal scholars, and then I can kind of draw on their work. But it would be interesting if such a kinetic conflict were to take place. It would likely not just be in the maritime domain. There would likely be an air component to that, or a land component, or a variety of different things, but not just one aspect. Um, and then we'd have to look at, what they call it, because we all know what's going on. I mean, we call correctly so what Russia is doing in Ukraine is their war of aggression against Ukraine, because that's what it is. And war crimes are being committed. All kinds of atrocities are being committed, but they call it, as most people watching this will know, a quote unquote special military operation. So, when it comes to the UN, when it comes to the law, the Russians know every comma, every period, every paragraph, and they manipulate that with their propaganda, with their disinformation. And of course, allied countries understand that, but there's also the cognitive element of this that really spans kind of politically, culturally, strategically. And this is part and parcel of the toolkit that they're using. So right now, what we're seeing, separate from what's going, I mean, everything, of course, is connected, but separate from their war of aggression against Ukraine, there are a lot of aggressive steps and measures that are happening in Poland and in the Baltic states, and in the Baltic Sea region, in the maritime domain, that are Russian aggression. Very clearly, no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no wiggling around that. It is Russian aggression. And so, of course, NATO planners are taking that into consideration throughout the domains.
Um, in your chapter, you mentioned the island of Gotland as a very important piece in the NATO strategic architecture, especially in the southern Baltic. Can you tell us what makes this island so important? Is it its sheer size or something else that distinguishes it from other strategically located Baltic islands?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that there are two areas, well, actually, really three areas that are focused potential flashpoints. One of them, of course, is the Suwałki corridor. The second would be Eastern Latvia in the region of Latgala, or potentially the Ido-Virma region of Estonia. But then the other one is the island of Gotland, and it matters not because of its size, but because of where it sits, where it is geographically located. So whoever controls the island of Gotland will gain leverage over air and sea routes in the southern part of the Baltic Sea. So for NATO, Gotland is a sensor hub. It could be a forward operating base and a denial platform. And losing that could potentially complicate reinforcement, and holding it would strengthen NATO's deterrence across the region if we get to a serious kinetic situation, or if we get to a situation where Russia tries to be uh, devious at Little Green Men or something like that. However, they would, do that. Maybe put some kind of shadow fleet vessel there with some suspicious people. But I think you get the point. So if we get to that situation, so right now it's integrated into the system, and it's of crucial importance because it would play a central role in helping the alliance secure the region if there was a kinetic confrontation with Russia. So to really, really hammer this home, whoever maintains strategic control over the island will be able to dominate both the air and maritime domains. And that's important because, as I mentioned, maritime and air are becoming more and more a part of this picture when you also include land. And it's been land centric first and foremost until the past couple of years. Um, so yeah, that is a very, very key place because the island could serve as a sensor and fires platform for maritime routes, a forward operating location for air and maritime assets, and a denial node. If it's held by an adversary, then it could complicate the alliance's ability to protect shipping and reinforce the Baltic states. So it's not mass. It's really where the island sits to influence the geometry of the potential fight. And by the way, I'm not making a prediction that that will happen. I'm saying if it does happen, because as I mentioned earlier, it is obviously best to prepare for these types of situations, even if we think that the actual feasibility is relatively low. I don't want to confuse people with the purpose of my chapter. It wasn't to make a prediction whether they would or whether they wouldn't, but it has gotten to the point where those questions are very, very seriously raised. So I think that already says something about the severity of the alliance's relationship with Russia right now in this theater.
Of course, thank you for clarifying that and for explaining the role of Gotland. Now, my last question to you is about what we call cross-theater dynamics. In your text, you link the Baltic Sea theater to the High North and the Indo-Pacific, as we already established in our conversation. NATO is a very far extended alliance with many points of engagement in different parts of the world. And what I would like to ask you about is if NATO is well prepared to manage simultaneous escalations across multiple theaters. And what really interests me is in the view of the recent progressing disengagement of the US from Europe by the current administration, by the current US administration, um, is the current state, is NATO in its current shape well prepared to manage simultaneous escalation in different parts of the world?
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I understand your question. Your question is basically about if NATO is ready to manage simultaneous conflicts. Well,
Yes.
I think that that's really so. I don't know if the United States right now could do a multi-front war. I'm not even talking about the political feasibility of that. Uh, I'll give a fairly long answer to this question because I hope that it's going to be useful to the listeners, because I think that so much focus right now is on what the United States is going to do under this current administration. So we have 3 years left in the second Trump administration. So after that, there will be a new president, and it could be from either party. And it is not very clear to a lot of people what a who might run for the Democratic Party and what their relationship will be to the transatlantic relationship. And it's also not clear who it might be. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is somebody who's very, very much a staunch transatlanticist. So I don't want to get into too much of guessing about who it's going to be and which party is going to win. My point is that we're seeing a very, very important development in NATO, which I don't think is necessarily bad, and that is that Europe is doing more. Now, when I say that, Poland and the Baltic states very much have always been doing that because of their understanding of Russia. They know Russia very, very well, and they're geographically on the front line. So they are fully incentivized to take their security and defense very, very seriously. And this is something that the current U.S. administration has said several times. The Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, has said this. They've called Poland and the Baltic states model allies. And I think what happened was that, the security environment changed, as did political understanding of NATO, which is not necessarily something new. I mean, the spending on security on defense has been something that has been raised by pretty much every single presidential administration. So I don't think that it is necessarily a bad thing at all for Europe to be approaching security with a changed calculus. I think where the sensitivity is how it is being vocalized by the Americans and at what time it is being vocalized. Now, that said, I do think that this administration would honor defense of Europe if it came to that, which I'm not so sure that it would. I think that if we have to worry about some kind of Russia, China, simultaneously, seizing Taiwan and making a move on NATO, respectively, that would be around the time of a next presidential election. And that's not a prediction of mine. It's just a scenario because I think strategic foresight is very important when trying to plan for these types of things. So I think that actually the situation is not as bad between Europe and the US as some people make it out to be. It's just the way that it's talked about. And that's going a little bit more politically to the question. So I will revert course and talk strategically, but feel free to jump in with a follow-up. So, the High North, the Baltic Sea region, and even the Indo-Pacific are really increasingly connected. And you asked about, you know, a multi-front engagement. Well, Russia, if you talk about this kind of classical um, multipolarity or bipolarity or unipolarity, I don't think that Russia fits quite up there with the US and China. I'm not even saying that we're in a bipolar world right now. We are getting close to that, but there are a lot of caveats where I think if you do see something, it'll be blocks of multipolarity, not two countries per se. And I think Europe has a major role in this. But Russia doesn't need to win everywhere. I don't think that that's their goal right now. I think that they're trying to stretch the attention of the United States and the attention of NATO. And I think that that's something where China fits in because of the whole Chinese-Russian friendship partnership without limits. And it's different than NATO. I mean, what binds NATO together is a collective set of ideas and values of countries that hold those who also have a mutual defense clause. Although Article 5 is, what nations want to contribute, and it's a political decision. But what really binds these areas together is this kind of notion of the global West, if we can use that term, which means countries like Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, the IP4, the Indo-Pac 4, are very much aligned closely with the Euro-Atlantic, and they share similar values. And Russia and China and others like the CRINCs, are the CRINC countries, which also includes North Korea and Iran, they don't, but they also see the US as being a force in their region, which runs counter to their force. The Chinese and the Russian center of gravity are regime survival and continuity. And that, autocracies run counter to Western values. So that is first and foremost what binds these areas together. Now, pressure from the upcoming, I think the next stage could be the Arctic, and around 5 or so years, half a decade, we are very likely to see ice-free weeks in the Arctic region. And the Arctic, of course, is contested. China is in the mix, but you also have Russia and then several NATO member states. Yeah. And that's going to be a very, very important strategic hub for transport if there are ice-free weeks, which by all accounts there will be. Um, the ongoing hybrid attacks in the Baltics and global distraction in the Indo-Pacific could potentially create strain, and I think that's why perception matters. So anytime any sign of a reduced U.S. commitment could risk testing behavior, even if some forces remain in place. And so right now, if you look at, the Americans, for example, relocating troops or slightly reducing troops, they're asking, NATO forces to do more. So this is a really golden opportunity for the alliance. Now, another thing that the Americans did is they encouraged the Europeans to focus on their own security so that they could focus on the Indo-Pacific. And you also see this bilateral aspect when it comes to the peace talks between the Trump administration and Mr. Putin, where then Europe, and I think this is what's going on right now. Europe is deciding how it's going to be as a security actor. Um, all but four states are in both the EU and NATO. You have only four now that are not in both, and those are different formats, a supranational format versus a multilateral format. And so NATO can manage multi-theater escalation if it treats it as a planning baseline, not necessarily as an edge case. So yes, the Baltic is connected with the high north and even to, politically and strategically, at least to the Indo-Pacific. But the hard part is not whether NATO can fight everywhere, but can they maintain credible deterrence everywhere, while reinforcing the most endangered points quickly enough. So in the high north, Russia could exploit its northern fleet and its Arctic posture. They could try and create a situation that would create reinforcement dilemmas, but it doesn't isolate the region automatically. It can force NATO into resource trade-offs, and I think that politically, resource trade-offs is where things should be going. Um, Russia could do a scenario where there's hybrid synchronization, so they could simultaneously jam GNSS. They can use cyber campaigns, which they've been doing for a long time now, more seabed incidents, and they could just overwhelm the political bandwidth and raise ambiguity. And this below the threshold pressure is something that will not stop. But what it has done, up even very recently as late November, early December, is it's led some countries in Europe to say, okay, this is a persistent problem. So we actually have to figure out how to address that. And some of those steps to addressing that may be being more assertive. Now, NATO is a defensive alliance, but there are different mechanisms that you can do with different political coalitions to address this from countries that are in both NATO and the European Union. And the last thing that I would like to say too is drawing the U.S. into this again. Of course, the Baltic Sea region is quite sensitive to perceptions of U.S. commitments. because there is a heavy psychological element to deterrence. So if Washington signals conditionality, or if it reduces certain funding lines, or certain political statements, that can, in principle, that can invite testing behavior, even if U.S. force posture does remain substantial. So, the key nuance is that there can be a slight gap between formal troop levels and political confidence. And let's not forget that, the Americans are the FLF framework nation in Poland. And they also have strong bilateral relationships with Poland, but they have strong bilateral relationships with all three of the Baltic states, and with Finland. So the US is actually invested in the region, and a lot of European diplomats and politicians are doing the right thing with the administration. And I'm not trying to paint an overly optimistic picture, but I'm also not trying to be overly pessimistic, because I think that there's a lot of that there. And I would say in closing that I think that we are in a fairly good position with Allied posture right now, especially in terms of Allied consensus. In a 32 member multilateral format, consensus, even amongst allies, can sometimes be difficult. And so I think it's a matter of perception. If there are tricky or strenuous political conversations, that doesn't mean that we're heading in the wrong direction, because those conversations are still being had. So I don't want to say that there's no more work to be done, no more work to be done, but I think that the compass is moving in the right direction, especially considering what's happened this past autumn.
Thank you very much for such nuanced and detailed response. My question was connected with worries shared by many people about the possibility that Russia may exploit this a bit of a transitional weakness in NATO eastern flank, where the US is uh, disengaging and Western and Europe in general is still trying to recover from years of negligence in terms of defense. But I think your response answers these worries very well. And I
Mhm.
think it's a very valuable insight from someone like you, a political scientist with experience in military and with expertise in both U.S. and the Baltic politics. So, uh, thank you very much for this conversation, and it was my great pleasure to have you here. And
Pleasure.
I wish you Merry Christmas.
My pleasure as well, and wish you a Merry Christmas too. And thank you for a really great interview. Please send it to me when it's up, and have a wonderful holiday.